In the ancient world, people needed something desperately enough. They had one way of buying it: blood. Sometimes an animal's blood. Sometimes, God help us, their own child. Today on the show, we're talking about the blood, what it costs and what it buys. From the fires of ancient Canaan to an altar in Jerusalem to a delivery room in Massachusetts. The blood has never stopped being currency. The question we're going to answer today is, who's cashing the check? This is the Marc Little Show. I'm Marc Little. I'm your host. I'm a pastor. I'm a lawyer. I'm a political commentator. And we'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Marc Little Show. I'm Marc Little. I am your host. I'm a pastor, lawyer, and a political commentator. Today's episode is called The Blood. What it costs, what it buys. Let's start in the ancient Near East, because you can't understand what's happening in a delivery room in Massachusetts right now without first understanding what happened outside the walls of Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. Across the ancient Near East, from Canaan to Ammon to Phoenicia, there was a practice that shows up again and again, both in Scripture and in the ground beneath these lands. Communities in crisis, facing siege, famine, or plague, believed that the blood of a child given in fire to a god could purchase deliverance. Scripture names it directly. Leviticus 18, verse 21, if you don't believe me. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Then 2 Kings 23, verse 10 tells us, King Josiah defiled Tophet in the valley of the son of Hinnom, so that in the words of Scripture, no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech. This was not abstract. It had an address, a valley outside the walls of Jerusalem itself, where the king of Judah, at their worst moments, gave their own children over to the fire. Now here's where the ground beneath your feet, literally, confirms the text. Archaeologists working at Carthage, the great Phoenician colony on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, have excavated a burial ground called a tophet, the same word Scripture uses for that valley outside Jerusalem. What they found were the cremated remains, thousands of infants, layered across centuries, alongside dedicatory stone markers called stelae, inscribed with the word Mo, dedicating the offering to the gods Baal, Haman, and his consort, Tanit. This was not a small or isolated find. Similar tophets have been identified at other Phoenician colonies across the western Mediterranean, in Sardinia, in Sicily, at Motia. This was a widespread religious system, practiced across an entire civilization. Not a single deranged cult in one city. Not at all. Why would a parent do this? Ancient sources point to national crisis, defeat in battle, famine, a besieging army at the gates. The logic was transactional and brutally simple. The god demanded blood in the most costly form imaginable in exchange for deliverance. And that pattern shows up again and again across the ancient world. Whatever people believed their gods required, a payment steep enough to prove sincerity. They paid it with the most valuable thing they had, their own children. Israel wasn't immune to this pull. 1 Kings chapter 11 tells us that Solomon built a high place for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. Wisest king in Israel's history. The man who built the temple ended his life having erected an altar to the very God Moses had warned against centuries earlier. If Solomon could be pulled toward this, none of us should assume that we're above the same gravitational pull. At the Carthage Tophet alone, researchers have cataloged thousands of burial urns spanning roughly 5 centuries of continuous use. From around the 8th century before Christ through the city's destruction by Rome in the 2nd century before Christ. This was not a single desperate act taken in one moment of crisis. It was an institution, a religious infrastructure maintained across generations, built on the deaths of children as a matter of ordinary practice. And Molech was not the only one demanding this kind of payment. 2 Kings chapter 17 lists multiple practices the northern kingdom of Israel adopted from the nations around them, including burning their sons and daughters as offerings, alongside divination and sorcery. Blood in the occult imagination of the ancient world was never merely biological. It was spiritually potent. It was the currency that opened doors, secured favors, and bound covenants with powers beyond the human world. That is precisely why God's people were commanded so forcefully to stay away from it. Not because blood itself was evil. We're about to see the next segment that God ordained its use himself, but because the pagan use of blood was leverage over spiritual worlds, it was a direct counterfeit of what God intended blood to actually accomplish. The prophet Jeremiah, he pronounced judgment precisely on this practice. Jeremiah chapter 7 describes the people building high places at Tophet to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something God says through the prophet he didn't command, nor did it ever enter his mind. Because of that, God declared the days were coming when that valley no longer be called Tophet, but the valley of slaughter, a place devoted to child sacrifice, would itself become a place of reckoning. There's a pattern in Scripture where the very ground used to shed innocent blood becomes the ground where judgment eventually falls. Hear me. I need you to sit with that before we move forward. Because that transactional logic, my crisis relief, purchased with my child's blood, does not stay buried. It just changes its clothes. We'll get there. But first, we need to understand what God did differently. That's where we're headed today on the blood. What it costs, what it buys. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is the Marc Little Show. I'm Marc Little. I am your host. I'm a pastor, lawyer, and a political commentator. Today's episode, the blood. What it costs, what it buys. So if the nations around Israel were offering their own children as payment to their gods, what was God doing differently with Israel? Because Israel had a sacrificial system too. Blood on an altar wasn't a foreign concept to God's people. The difference is who was doing the paying and who initiated the whole arrangement. Leviticus 17, verse 11. Here goes. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement. Read that again. God says, I have given it for you. It's not a system where desperate people are trying to figure out what will appease an angry deity and then guessing wrong for centuries. This is God initiating, prescribing, providing the substitute himself. An animal's life given in the place of a human life. Not a child given as a bribe. A substitute given as a gift by God, who made the whole arrangement possible in the first place. That's the entire architecture of the Levitical sacrificial system. Sin creates a debt. Something has to die because the wages of sin is death. That's not just New Testament language. That principle runs through the whole of Scripture. But God, rather than demanding that the sinner's own child pay the debt, the way Molech did, he provided a substitute. A lamb, a goat, a bull, something set apart, without blemish, standing in the place of the one who owed the debt. This is why the sacrificial system existed. Not because God enjoyed the smell of burnt offerings, not because he was petty and needed to be appeased, like the ancient people believed about Molech. The sacrificial system existed because sin is real. Death is the consequence. And God, out of mercy, provided a way for that debt to be paid without demanding the sinner's own child. And here's the fruit of it: atonement, covering. The Hebrew word carries the sense of covering over, of a relationship restored that sin had broken. The Israelite walked away from that altar with his sin covered, not because he found a way to pay God off, but because God had already made the payment possible. Hold on to that, because everything the next segment is about to tell you only makes sense if you understand that the entire Old Testament sacrificial system was never the end point. It was a shadow, a pointer, something temporary pointing towards something final. And I love it. We'll pick that up right after this, here on The Blood, what it costs, what it buys. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Marc Little Show. I am Marc Little. I'm your host. I'm a pastor, lawyer, and a political commentator. Today's episode, The Blood, what it costs, what it buys. So the Old Testament sacrificial system pointed forward. Forward to what? Glad you asked. Hebrews chapter 9 answers that about as directly as Scripture ever answers anything. Go to verse 22. It says, indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. That's not a New Testament writer inventing a new theology. That's a New Testament writer looking back at everything we just walked through in segment 2 and saying, yes, that principle was always true. And now let me show you where it was always headed. Because here's the problem with the Levitical system. It never actually finished the job. The author of Hebrews makes this point too. Those sacrifices had to be repeated year after year. The same offerings, the same blood. Because animal blood, as a substitute, could cover, but it can never fully, finally settle the account. It was a temporary provision, pointing toward a permanent one. Enter Jesus Christ. Hebrews describes him as the great high priest who entered the most holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood. And Scripture says he did this once for all time. Not annually, not repeatedly, once. Finished. Here's why that matters. And this is the center of the entire Christian gospel. Jesus wasn't a third party paying off a debt that had nothing to do with him. He was both the priest offering the sacrifice and the sacrifice itself. He didn't demand someone else's child. He gave himself. Think about the contrast we've built. Molech demanded the child of the worshiper. Yahweh provided a substitute, so the worshiper's child would never be required. And in the New Testament, God goes one step further than substitution. He gives his own son, second person of the Godhead, not a stranger's child, not an animal, his own. The fruit of that sacrifice is not a temporary covering that has to be renewed every year. The fruit is full atonement, adoption. Hebrews and Romans both use family language here, not just legal language, because what Christ's blood purchased wasn't a clean slate you have to keep re-earning. It was a permanent, settled relationship, sonship. That's the opposite of every ancient system we've talked about, where the relationship with the God was never secure, always one crisis away from demanding another payment. If that phrase, full atonement, adoption, sonship, sounds familiar, it should. We spent an entire 3-part series on this program, The Marc Little Show, called The Works of the Cross, one of my favorite. We unpacked everything Christ's blood purchased. Episode 1 in particular laid out 6 permanent, unconditional facts, secured the very moment you believed. Justification, redemption, adoption, propitiation, forgiveness, access. None of them possible without the blood we're talking about today. If you haven't heard that series, you don't miss it. Go back and find it. Everything we're building today rests on that foundation. So here's where we are. Ancient world, your child pays for your survival. Old Testament, God provides an animal so your child never has to die. New Testament, God gives his own son once, and the debt is closed permanently. Now, we've got to talk about where our own culture is right now in this country, where it's landed on that spectrum. Because we're not as far from segment 1 as we'd like to believe. Massachusetts, let's start there, since it's recent and specific. In August of this year, Governor Maura Healey signed legislation removing every gestational limit on abortion in her state. No cutoff, not one drawn anywhere before birth. That made Massachusetts the 10th state, alongside Washington, D.C., to hold that position. And every single one of them has gone further than Roe versus Wade itself ever mandated. Roe drew lines. What we have now, 10 states, draws none. I've called this a march, not a march towards something new. A march past something that was already, by any honest historical measure, permissive. None of what we're talking about today touches the blood given in a hospital the blood shed by a soldier in a just war, the blood lost in an accident that was nobody's fault, or the blood of a loved one taken by violence no one asked for. We're talking about one specific thing: blood offered on purpose as payment in exchange for something the one offering it wants to receive. That is the category. That's the only category. And when you put it in those terms, the parallel to what we discussed at the top of this show gets uncomfortably specific. The ancient worshiper offered his child to relieve himself of a crisis he didn't want to face. Whether that crisis was a famine, a war, or simply an inconvenient season of life. The theologian Carl Henry, writing decades ago, called abortion, I quote, the horrendous modern immolation of millions of fetuses on the altar of sex gratification, end quote. Immolation, altar. Henry wasn't reaching for poetry. He was using the vocabulary of ancient sacrifice on purpose because he saw the same transaction we're talking about today. If you think that comparison is only a preacher's rhetorical device, listen to how one modern organization describes itself. The Satanic Temple, a federally recognized religious organization, calls what they perform in connection with abortion the religious abortion ritual, taken directly from their own website. The ritual involves reciting two of their official tenets in what they describe as a personal affirmation ceremoniously intertwined with the abortion procedure itself. They have filed lawsuits, Missouri, Texas, arguing that the state abortion restrictions violate their religious liberty to perform this ritual. And in 2023, they opened an online clinic deliberately named after the mother of a sitting United States Supreme Court justice to dispense abortion medication by mail as an exercise of that same religious practice. Abortion by mail. How many of you done that? I'm not the one calling abortion a ritual sacrifice. An organization that explicitly identifies with the satanic tradition is telling you, in its own words, that it is one. When the ancient world offered a child to Molech, they at least called it what it was. Here in 2026, an occult organization is doing the same thing in daylight with legal representation. Consider what that actually means. This is not a fringe internet conspiracy. This is a legally organized religious body recognized by our own federal government for tax purposes that has built litigation strategy, public billboard advertising, and now a mail order medical clinic. They didn't reach for occult imagery by accident. Baphomet, the horned figure central to their public branding, has stood for generations as a symbol of exactly the kind of transactional, blood-bound spirituality we described at the top of this show. This is the ancient pattern. Wearing modern legal paperwork This comparison is not new, and it was not invented by modern activists trying to score a rhetorical point. The early church father Tertullian, writing around the turn of the 3rd century, drew this same connection, comparing the practice of infant exposure and infanticide in the Roman world to the child sacrifice practiced at Carthage. 1,800 years ago, a Christian writer looked at his own culture's treatment of unwanted children and said, this is the same thing the pagans did, just without the altar and the fire. This is not a claim that there's a direct, provable, historical chain connecting a Canaanite tophet to a clinic in 2026. That's not a claim historians would make. This is a moral and theological parallel. The logic is the same. A vulnerable life offered up on purpose so that someone else's crisis can be relieved. Whether the altar has a fire on it or fluorescent lighting doesn't change what's happening underneath that light. And that vulnerable life is not incidental to this conversation. Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Every single life we've been discussing today. The child offered to Molech, the child protected by the Levitical system, the son offered once for all, and the child in a womb in any one of those 10 states carries the same stamp, the image of God. It's not a religious opinion that I hold privately. That is the theological foundation this entire episode has been building toward since the moment we mentioned Molech. So here's where we've been. Blood has never been neutral. Not in Canaan, not on a Levitical altar, not on a cross outside Jerusalem, and not in a delivery room in Massachusetts. Every one of those is blood, offered for a reason. The ancient world offered it to false gods out of desperation. God provided a substitute so his people wouldn't have to. Christ offered his own blood once to end the whole system for good. And now we live in a culture that has, in at least 10 states, plus our nation's capital, reopened the very altar Christ's blood was supposed to close. I am Marc Little. I've been your host. Until next time, remember this. Spill it as currency, and you've built your own altar to Molech. He's still asking for payment. Remember that.